at us and amen. Good news, bad news, who's to say? The theme of the message this morning is that sometimes it's hard to know whether the news that we're getting in the long term will be good news, or what seemingly might be bad news might have some good in it. There are a couple of cartoons that I would show you. The first is a story from an anxious teenager who says, Mom and Dad, I just got the van washed, and the bad news is, well, you can see for yourself. In the next one, the good news is that they're going to widen 183. The bad news is it's going to take a 15-year project. The bad news, sire, is that the famine is getting worse. The good news is that the food facts are way down. The bad news is that your uncle has been in a coma for 2 weeks. The good news is that he hasn't had a cigarette for 14 days. Which brings us to another story, or actually two stories that are both good news and bad news, which indicates that these stories, one coming from a Chinese culture and one coming from India, they are archetypal of a story that we will read about Joseph in just a moment. Probably many of you have heard the story in one variation or another of a Chinese farmer who is a little bit above most of his neighbors because he, unlike them, has a horse, and he uses the horse to plow his fields, he uses it to bring in the grain, and so he is somewhat affluent in a very impoverished area. And one day the horse runs away, gets out of the corral and runs up into the mountain, and apparently has been lost. And so the neighbors come to the Chinese farmer to commiserate, and they say, we're sad that you've lost such a valuable resource. And the philosophizing Chinese farmer says, bad news, good news, who's to say? In 2 weeks or so, this runaway horse has decided that foraging in the mountains is not so good, and so it decides to return to the corral where there's a bale of hay, and it brings with it some Mustang horses. And they're able to corral these horses from the wild. And so now, not having just one horse, he has several and potentially has great profit from those. And so now the neighbors come to celebrate with him, and he simply says, good news, bad news, who's to say? The farmer's son decides that he will break the horses so that they could be sold for profit, and in the process is bucked off and has a severe break in his leg. Apparently it's bad news. About that time, there is a warlord who's going through the area, and he's conscripting all of the young men under a certain age that are not married, and the only one that is not taken into conflict where many are killed is a young man with a broken leg. Bad news, good news, who's to say? And then the story from India. It's about a prince who's coddled and pampered and has his way with everything. One day is out in a hunt with a servant, and he accidentally cuts himself and has a slight tear in the webbing between his thumb and his finger. And although the servant quickly bandages it, the prince is complaining about the intense pain of that minor cut. And so the servant tries to give him perspective by saying, but it will only take a few days and you'll hardly even know that the cut is there. And the prince is enraged because seemingly his servant is minimizing his pain and this great cut on his finger. And so he forces the servant down into an abandoned cistern through a rope, and he pulls the rope up and he's going to leave him there, and he goes away. He's going to teach his servant a lesson. And in the brief period of time in which he's away from his servant, he is met by a group of primitive tribes people who capture the prince, and they take him away, and he begins to understand, although he doesn't always understand their language, he knows what's about to happen. They're going to offer a sacrifice, and he's their offering. And the priest of the tribe comes out, and just before the sacrifice is to take place, he inspects the offering, and he notices the bandage on the hand. And he unwraps it, and obviously is disappointed and shakes his head, he indicates, this is a sacrifice with a flaw. It cannot be offered. And as quickly as the prince had been captured, he's released. And he quickly goes back to the place where he's left his servant in the cistern. He drops the rope, helps him out, and then he tells the servant about what has happened and profusely begins to apologize to the servant. I have abused you. I'm so sorry. And the servant says, you owe me no apology. If I had been with you, I would have been the sacrifice. Bad news. Good news. It's sometime in the moment impossible to say. The story this morning is found in Genesis chapter 37 through 50. It is the story of Joseph. And I want to read just the first part of the story in chapter 37, and we'll get a picture of the family dynamics in the home of Joseph. Chapter 37, verse 2. This is the account of Jacob. He's the father. He's sometimes called Israel in the passage. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks of his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, that's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of the other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him a richly ornamented robe. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word about him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And then he had another dream, and he told this to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he said this to his father as well as to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept these matters in his mind. And I think we could summarize the story of Joseph in 3 ways. We're going to talk about Joseph's family, Joseph's frustration, and Joseph's fulfillment. I want to start with Joseph's family and the fact that his father, called either Jacob or Joseph, he has 4 women by which he has children. 2 of these are called his wives. Well, there are 4 that are called his wives, but 2 of these he's actually married to. He's married to 2 sisters. Think about that. Married to 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel. But then he has children by 2 other women in the household, the handmaidens of Rachel and Leah, Bilhah and Zilpah. So there's 4 women by which the same man has children, and there's 12 sons. You think there might be a few sibling rivalries in that household? There is enormous tension. By name, Jacob means heel grabber. You remember the story when he and Esau were born, and how Esau came out the first twin, and Jacob, his little hand extending from the womb, had his brother's heel, as if he wanted to grab his position and be the firstborn himself. And so they call him Grabber. And later in life, he proves to be a deceiver. He will deceive his own family. He'll deceive his brother in order to get position. He'll deceive his father. And so it's not surprising that this is a very dysfunctional family. Jacob the leader, and then he has Joseph as one of his sons. And in the family dynamics, there's open animosity and hatred. The older brothers hate Joseph, and it's not without cause. You see, Joseph is a snitch. He's a tattletale. Any of you older children remember your younger brother or sister, and when you did something wrong, they're always going to mom or dad and saying, "But he looked at me. Do you know what she did when you left the house?" And so the brothers began to create a real animosity for their younger brother, Joseph. And then there's another reason that they began to distrust him and dislike him. It says Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers, they hated him all the more. He was a boastful dreamer. That's one thing for Joseph to have a dream. To dream about the fact that he's going to be prominent and that others will bow before him. But you don't tell that to your older siblings. And so they began to hate him still more. And then there is a third reason that they hate him. It's suggested in this passage, now Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of the other sons. The father showed open favoritism to Joseph. Joseph was Jacob's favorite. And the brothers hate him still more. There is a symbol of the family dysfunction in a gift that Father Jacob gives to Joseph. It's called a coat of many colors. Now, it's very difficult to actually translate that. There's a contemporary musical that's talking about Joseph and his colored green coat. Probably the Hebrew indicates something like this. What Jacob gave Joseph was a coat with sleeves. He got a sports coat, a colorful sports coat. Now, I see there's a few of you that might even have a sports coat on this morning. It's not inappropriate. But think about it. Joseph is a shepherd. The other boys work out in the field in whatever work clothes they have. Here is Joseph who comes to work wearing a sports coat. There's not too many shepherds in the field in sports coats. Which brings us to Joseph's frustration. And I'll just mention 3 of those in the passage. One of those frustrations is the fact that the family, the brothers, abused Joseph. He's abused by his family. You probably would be familiar with the next chapter where here is Father Jacob, who is totally out of touch with reality. He sends his favorite, his pampered son, Joseph, to follow the brothers and bring back a report. What are your older brothers doing? Well, the older brothers see Joseph coming because he's wearing a sports coat that's very colorful, and they begin to determine what they're going to do. The first thought is, we're going to kill him. We'll take that coat, dip it in animal blood, and we'll take it back to Dad, and Dad will begin to think, well, what could have happened to my son? Here I find his coat. Must have been devoured by wild animals. But an older head rules in this situation. He says, no, let's don't kill him. And they decide that they will sell him into slavery because there is a caravan of traders that is coming by, and they're going to make a modest profit by selling their brother as a slave. And so now, here's the pampered favorite of Jacob's household who's suddenly a slave in Egypt. Isn't that bad news? Can you imagine being a slave in a place where you couldn't even speak the language? Joseph becomes the slave of Potiphar, a captain of the guard, and something begins to be obvious to Potiphar. This young man has extraordinary abilities. He has abilities to manage and to administrate. And before long, Joseph had become the #1 person in Potiphar's household. Notice what's happened. when he experienced the bad news as a slave in Egypt, he began to develop as a person, and his managerial skills were obvious. And he's given greater and greater responsibility. Now think with me about a hypothetical situation. What if Father Jacob knew that his son was not dead, but he was alive in Egypt? What would he have done? Don't you think that Jacob would have tried with all of his resources to go into Egypt and extricate his son Joseph from a horrible situation? And what would have happened? Joseph would have gone back again as a pampered son to be perhaps one of the main shepherds of the area. But in fact, Joseph was created for grander destiny. Joseph was going to be a person so powerful that he would have the ability to save tens of thousands of lives. But now, he's a slave in Egypt. And it looks like things are getting worse. Potiphar's wife notices Joseph. He's a virile, handsome young man, and she, on various occasions, tries to seduce this young man. He rejects and always tries to maintain a position of integrity. On one occasion, she even grabs for him, and he leaves the room with his cloak in her hand. And because she's been rebuffed, she suddenly tells her servants and eventually her husband that this young foreigner has assaulted her. And her husband forces Joseph into prison. You and I would not want to be imprisoned in Egypt. Neither today nor during Joseph's day. This is a despicable place. How could it get any worse for Joseph? He's trying to live with integrity. He's resisting the temptation of Potiphar's wife. And now what has happened to him is not fair. Why would God let this happen when I've tried to be a person living with values and integrity? What's going to happen to Joseph in an Egyptian prison? It's interesting. It says in Genesis 39:20 and 21, but while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those in prison. He's a prisoner, but he's an unpaid administrator of the Egyptian penal system. He's the person who is managing what's happening in the prison. And these skills as an administrator, as one who is working successfully in developing systems, are beginning to develop. And where they're developing is in an Egyptian prison. While he's there, he's over the authority of all these other prisoners. And two of those who have been rejected by the Pharaoh because they've displeased him are now in prison. One was the former butler, and one was a baker. And both of those had dreams. And they brought their dreams to Joseph. And Joseph told the butler, your dream means that in 3 days you will be released from prison and you will again serve the Pharaoh. It's good news. The baker, hearing that, assumed that his dream, having similar facts to it, would also have a positive ending. And he told Joseph his dream, but Joseph said, in 3 days you will be hanged. Sure enough, the butler was freed. But Joseph had extracted a promise. When the butler is released from prison, he was to bring a favorable report to the Pharaoh. But did he remember? No. Like so many of us, when we get what we want, we forget about our promise. And the butler forgot. But the butler observed that Joseph had the ability not only to interpret his dream, but the dream of the baker, because it also was fulfilled as Joseph had said. Now the next chapter in the story, the Pharaoh has 2 dreams. You remember that occasion? Here's the Pharaoh, the most prominent person in Egypt, and he dreams something like this. There are 7 fat cows that come up out of the Nile. And following them are 7 very gaunt, lean, dehydrated cows. And the 7 lean cows, following the fat ones, they consume them, but they're no fatter. And then he has a second dream, and this is a dream about 7 stalks of grain, very lush and full. And then there's 7 withered pieces of grain, and the withered grain consumes the healthy, but gets no healthier in doing it. No one can interpret the dreams, but at that point the butler remembers Joseph, who is still in prison. And he brings Joseph before the Pharaoh. And Joseph, when he is told that he could interpret dreams, denies that, and he says, I cannot interpret your dream. Only God can interpret the future. But the meaning of your dream is this. There will be, both dreams mean the same thing. They mean that there will be 7 years in Egypt of prosperity, the 7 fat cows, the 7 lush heads of grain, followed by 7 years of famine, the gaunt cows, the withered grain. And so it would be wise for you, Pharaoh, to gather grain in the next 7 years and provide for the inevitable famine that is coming. And then I read for you over in chapter 41, as the Pharaoh responds to this interpretation. It says in verse 37, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all of his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace and all my people, and they shall submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Joseph is taken from a prison to the position of second authority in Egypt, having only less authority than the Pharaoh. You probably are familiar with the story of how everything happens as Joseph had predicted, but because of his management and preparation, Egypt, as the famine begins to take place in the Middle East, Egypt is the one country well prepared with these storehouses of grain, so that people from other areas began to come to Egypt. Among those are people from the Holy Land, the family members of Joseph, the brothers who betrayed him, come to Egypt to buy grain. And initially, Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. They could never have imagined the one who is disseminating the grain over the entire country of Egypt is their younger brother. To test them, he requires that when they take their grain back, they're to eventually bring back their younger brother, Benjamin, his full brother, the only other son of Rachel, to see how they will treat Benjamin. And eventually, when they prove trustworthy, when they indicate that their family animosity no longer exists, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. They have bowed before him. They have told him that they are his slaves. And we see in this the fulfillment. Joseph's fulfillment. He saw his dreams come true. Remember early on, he had seen that they were going to bow down to him. And in fact, as they come from the Holy Land to Egypt to buy grain, on numerous occasions, they bow before him, even before they recognize him as their younger sibling. The whole family is reunited. And there is a healthiness that now exists in the family relationships that had never existed before the brothers betrayed him. And then he saw how God was using all of the events of his life in a creative purpose. There is one more dramatic scene. He had gone and brought his father Jacob to the area of Egypt that is most fertile, the land of Goshen near the Nile Delta. You see, the famine was still going on, but his family began to prosper in that land of Goshen. The father, Jacob, secured from Joseph the promise that when he died, his body would be taken back to the Holy Land and buried there among the patriarchs. And Joseph did that when his father died. And now the family and the caravan of family members come back to Egypt. And you know the older brothers fear at this point? They feared that since their father was now gone, Joseph might exact vengeance for the way that they had betrayed him earlier in life. And at that point, Joseph made this statement, recorded in Genesis 50:19. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You intended it for evil, but God is working his creative purpose even in bad news to bring good for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose." You see, whether it's the story of the Chinese farmer, the Indian prince, or the Jewish patriarch named Joseph, this is a story about all of us. I like the way it was written up in this plaque. The words are from Janet Mulaney. She says, "Good news, bad news, good news. The good news is this: everything God created in heaven and on earth, he created good. The bad news is this, that mankind messed it up when he believed a lie instead of God. And then there's good news again. God knew and had a plan from the start of creation to redeem sinful man. He would send his beloved Son to crush Satan's head. By the work of the cross and his sacrifice, now all men can be saved." I want you to think for just a moment about a day that we will commemorate in a matter of weeks. Just before Easter Sunday, the Friday before, is the day that we now commemorate as the time in which Jesus was crucified. For the disciples of Jesus that day, it was the most shocking, horrifying event that they could imagine. What is the designation that we now use to describe the day that Jesus was crucified? In retrospect, we call it Good Friday. Good news? Bad news? It's not who's to say. It's bad news, good news, you. You will say. You will say whether that which Jesus did on Good Friday is to your advantage whether or not you would be willing to accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. We sang about it a moment ago. He who knew no sin became sin that we might become the righteousness of God. Bad news? Good news? You can say. Would you pray with me? Father, in just the quiet moments of reflection, would we, in our own hearts, in our own ways, personalize the opportunity that Christ affords each of us to appropriate the sacrifice that he made in our behalf, to accept by faith the gift that is offered by God through his Son, that which seemed to be so horrifically evil has been used in your creative purpose to bring freedom and liberation. And Father, may we be recipients of that good news. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.